The morning Eva Grayson pointed a dirt-caked finger at a stranger on horseback and demanded to know what he thought he was staring at. She had already been awake for 4 hours, had buried a calf that hadn't made it through the night, had mended a fence line that the eastern wind had knocked sideways, and had not eaten a single thing since the dry biscuit she'd forced down at dawn the previous day. She was not in the mood for company. The year was 1874, and the town of Harrow Creek, Kansas, sat baking on the edge of the Flint Hills like a forgotten coin dropped by God in a hurry. It was the kind of place that swallowed men whole and spat out their boots. The summer had come early and vicious, and the land had cracked along its seams like old leather, the soil splitting apart in long dark lines that reminded Eva of grief itself. She understood that comparison better than most women her age, which was 29, which in Harrow Creek felt ancient and wise and exhausted all at once. She had been a widow for 16 months. Thomas Grayson had been a good man, not a perfect one, but steady in the way that mattered out here where the wind never stopped, and the cattle got sick in winter, and the bank in town had a way of looking at a woman alone with something between pity and hunger. Thomas had died of a fever in February of 1873, a fever that came on a Tuesday and took him by the following Sunday, and Eva had buried him herself with the help of their neighbor, old Hector Buell, because the ground had been half frozen, and the pastor in town was 3 days' ride away, and Thomas would not have wanted a fuss. She had not cried at the funeral. She had been too busy holding everything together. She cried later, alone in the dark, with her face pressed into the pillow that still smelled like him for about 2 weeks before it stopped. The farm was 60 acres of hard-won Kansas earth, a modest homestead by the standards of men who had not had to scratch it from nothing. But Eva and Thomas had built it from the ground up with government land and government promises, and a great deal of their own blood and bone. There was a main house, a barn that leaned slightly west, a vegetable garden that Eva maintained with a ferocity that her late husband had once called beautiful and her neighbors called frightening, a small orchard of 3 apple trees that had survived 1 devastating frost and 2 dry summers, and a chicken coop that contained 11 hens with strong opinions. She had 1 farmhand, a 16-year-old boy named Micah, who came 3 days a week from the Buell property, and who was worth his weight in what little gold existed in Harrow Creek. She had no family nearby. Her mother had passed in 1868, her father in 1870, and her one brother lived in St. Louis doing something in printing that she approved of but could not entirely picture. He wrote her letters that arrived months late and were full of concern she didn't ask for and could not use. She managed. That was the thing about Eva Grayson. She managed. And then on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1874, she was crouched in her vegetable garden pulling up the winterkill root vegetables that had not survived the hard ground, her hands black with soil, her dark hair pulled back and coming loose at the temples, her expression carrying the particular concentration of a woman engaged in a conversation with the earth itself, and she felt the weight of being watched. She looked up. There was a man on a horse at the edge of her property line, just beyond the split-rail fence that marked where her land began. He sat his horse the way certain men do, easy and still at the same time, like the animal beneath him was an extension of his own will. He was perhaps 32 or 33, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat practically, wearing a trail-worn canvas coat over a dark shirt, a hat pulled low against the morning glare, and a look on his face that she could only describe, even at this distance, as frank. He was not leering. He was not assessing in the calculating way of the men from the bank. He was simply watching, the way a person watches something that has caught their attention without permission. She stood up. She looked at him directly. "What do you think you are staring at?" She called out across the gap, her voice carrying easily in the flat, still air, the words sharp and without apology. The man straightened slightly in his saddle. He tipped his hat back just a fraction and she saw the bottom half of his face better, a jaw that needed shaving, a mouth that was not smiling but was not entirely straight either. "Your fence, ma'am," he called back. "Third post from the east, it's leaning." She turned and looked. She had not, in all her morning's work, noticed that the third post from the east was indeed leaning at a precarious angle, the upper rail sagging with it in a way that would allow cattle to push through without much effort at all. She looked back at him. "I know it's leaning," she said, because she was not going to let a stranger on a horse be more observant than she was on her own property. He nodded once slowly, as if this satisfied him entirely. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more habit than ceremony, turned his horse, and began to ride east along the road that ran parallel to her fence line. Eva watched him go. She looked back at the post. Then she went to find her tools. His name was Clayton Dalton, though she did not know that yet. She learned it 3 days later at the general store in Harrow Creek, which was also the post office and sometimes the informal court of local news, presided over by a man named Gerald Phelps who had the build of a fence post and the disposition of someone who had recently swallowed something sideways. Eva had come in for seed packets and salt, and she was standing at the counter when she heard the name mentioned behind her. "Dalton took on the Cutter place," said one man to another, somewhere in the proximity of the dry goods. "Did he now?" said the second voice, with the tone of someone filing information. "Signed the lease with old Meredith Cutter before she went to Wichita to live with her daughter. 3 years, I heard. What do you know about him?" "Enough. He rode for a trail outfit out of Texas for about 6 years, came up through the Kisham doing cattle drives. Comes recommended by some men in Dodge City. He's quiet. Quiet can mean a lot of things. Quiet can. But the kind of quiet that works hard at honest work is different from the other kind, and from what I hear, Dalton is the former." Eva had gathered her purchases and walked out without contributing to the conversation, as she generally preferred to do in Gerald Phelps's store, where anything you said before noon was currency for gossip by afternoon. But she carried the name with her back to the wagon, and she put it away in her mind the way you put something small and potentially useful on a high shelf. Clayton Dalton, the Cutter place. The Cutter place was 1.5 miles east of her property. He was her neighbor. She did not see him again for nearly a week, and then she saw him twice in one day, which was the kind of thing the flat Kansas landscape arranged without warning or apology. The first time was at the creek that ran along the southern edge of both their properties, where Eva had gone to check the water level after the previous night's thin rain, and where she found him already standing on the opposite bank doing what appeared to be the same assessment. They looked at each other across 12 feet of slow brown water. "Clayton Dalton," he said, "Cutter place." "I know," she said. "Eva Grayson." "I know," he said. The second time was at Hector Buell's property, where Hector had called on his neighbors to help shift a piece of fallen timber that had come down in the night across his access road. A task that required multiple sets of hands, and that was also, as Hector's gatherings always were, accompanied by coffee and whatever baked goods his wife, Nellie, had made that morning. Nellie Buell was 71 and treated all gatherings as opportunities to feed people whether they needed feeding or not, which Eva generally considered one of the finest qualities a human being could possess. Clayton Dalton arrived on foot, having walked the mile from the Cutter place, and he worked with a methodical efficiency that Eva noticed without trying to. He did not shout or grandstand. He listened to Hector's instructions, offered one quiet suggestion about leverage that turned out to be the right one, and when the timber was moved and the coffee was poured, he sat on Hector's porch steps with his mug and said very little. Hector's boy, 16-year-old Micah, who worked Eva's farm on his 3 days a week, sat next to Clayton and asked him about trail driving with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that only a 16-year-old can produce. And Clayton answered the questions with a patience and lack of condescension that Eva noted with something she recognized as approval. Nellie Buell pressed a second corn cake on everyone, including Eva, who accepted it because arguing with Nellie Buell was a fight you had already lost before you started. "You managing all right?" Nellie asked Eva quietly, squeezing her hand for a moment in the way old women do when they mean more than the words. "I'm managing," Eva said. "Thomas has been gone a while now, 16 months. The land doesn't care how long it's been, it just asks you to keep going." "I know, I do keep going." Nellie looked at her with eyes that were 71 years old and had seen most things. "Keeping going and living are not always the same thing, Eva." Eva had no answer for this, so she drank her coffee. On the ride home, she thought about what Nellie had said, and about the way it landed in a part of her she didn't often open. She was alive. She was working. The farm was not only surviving but beginning, very tentatively, to move toward something better. The winter wheat crop had come up strong. The chickens were productive. The apple trees had budded for the first time with real promise. And she was so tired that some mornings she stood in the kitchen before dawn and simply breathed for a moment before she could begin. May came in hot and wild, the way it did in Kansas, with storms that came up out of nowhere and did their business violently, and then left. And one morning Eva woke to find that the storm the previous night had taken the roof of her barn half off. Not all the way, not a catastrophe, but enough that the exposed section was letting in light and would let in water at the next rain, and the next rain was, by the look of the western sky, approximately 2 days away. Micah was not due until Thursday. Eva stood in the barnyard and looked up at the damage and did the arithmetic of what she could accomplish alone, and the answer was not enough. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard hooves on the road and looked up, and it was Clayton Dalton riding past with what appeared to be lumber in his wagon, presumably for something on the Cutter place, and he slowed when he saw her standing in the yard staring at the barn, which was the kind of thing a person notices when they are paying attention. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the fence. "Storm damage," he called. "Yes," she said, because there was no graceful way to deny it. He looked at the barn for a moment and she could see him reading it the way men who know structures read them, quickly and with practical conclusions. "I have the materials," he said. "And the morning." She looked at him. "I do not need charity," she said. "I know," he said. "Neighbors help each other. It's not charity, it's the arrangement. I'll need help moving my south water trough before the summer comes on and I can't do it alone. We'll call it even." She looked at him for another moment. He was watching her with those direct eyes of his, patient in a way that was not aggressive, not pressing, simply there. "All right," she said. He climbed down from the wagon. They worked through the morning side by side, and Eva discovered several things about Clayton Dalton in those hours. He worked with a quietness that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that came from a man who was simply thinking about the task, rather than filling the air to avoid thinking. He asked before he did anything that affected her property or her materials. When he had an opinion about how something should be done, he offered it once and then followed her lead if she disagreed, which she did twice, and both times she turned out to be right, and he acknowledged it without any visible wound to his pride. His hands were capable and scarred in small ways from years of work, and he moved without wasted motion in the way of people who have learned that economy is its own kind of grace. By noon, the barn roof was secured, better than it had been, actually, because Clayton had reinforced the section that had always given her trouble and she had been too busy to address. Nellie Buell had sent Micah over with a pot of something at mid-morning, because Nellie Buell had a sixth sense about when people were working hard and unfed, and so they ate standing up in the barnyard with plates balanced on the fence, beef stew that tasted like something close to comfort. "You've been in Kansas long?" Eva asked because the silence had been comfortable enough for long enough that a question felt allowed. "About 8 months," Clayton said. "Before that I was driving cattle out of Texas for years. Before that I was from Missouri originally." "What made you stop driving and settle?" He looked at the horizon for a moment, which was his habit when he was choosing words carefully rather than just producing them. "A man gets tired of moving," he said. After a while, the trail starts to feel less like freedom and more like avoiding something. I decided I'd rather face something instead. And what did you need to face? He looked at her with something that was almost a smile at one corner. I hadn't figured that out yet when I got here. Kansas has a way of showing you. She did not entirely understand what he meant, but she thought she might understand the feeling underneath it. Did you have family back in Missouri? She asked. Parents both gone now. A sister in St. Louis. We write occasionally. I have a brother in St. Louis, she said. He prints newspapers. My sister teaches school, he said. Small world for a large territory. She smiled at this briefly, and he saw it. And something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite name and chose not to examine too closely. They moved his water trough the following Saturday, and it was easier than advertised because Micah came 2 and 3 sets of hands made the work practical rather than brutal, and Nellie sent corn cakes again, which Micah ate 4 of without any apparent ceiling, and Hector came over to offer advice from a seated position, because his knees were not what they had once been, and the whole thing had the texture of community rather than labor, which Eva had not experienced in quite this concentrated a form since before Thomas died. June arrived. The summer heat settled in like a guest who had never intended to leave, and the work on the farm expanded accordingly. Eva was in the fields by 5 in the morning, checking on the wheat that was growing strong and straight, negotiating with the irrigation situation that was never entirely right, managing the garden that fed her through the hot months, keeping the animals healthy and the structures sound. She saw Clayton regularly now, with the frequency that comes naturally when 2 people work neighboring properties and use the same creek and the same road, and occasionally have need of each other's fence posts or borrowed tools. They had fallen into a pattern of easy transaction, the kind that feels like it has been established for years rather than weeks, a nod of recognition here, a brief exchange there, sometimes a longer conversation at the creek or the fence line, or when one of them was riding past at a time when the other happened to be visible. She noticed things about him in the accumulating way of observation over time. He rose as early as she did, and she could sometimes see the light in the Cutter Place windows across the distance when she was still in her kitchen before dawn. He was meticulous with his animals in a way that spoke well of him. He rode with a particular ease that was the product of years in the saddle, and his horse, a dark bay he called Remnant, was in excellent condition and clearly trusted him completely. He did not drink heavily, which she had confirmed by the absence of whiskey smell in any of their interactions, and by the fact that he was never seen at the Harrow Creek Saloon, which was a low-ceilinged establishment called the Lucky Draw that she had only been inside twice, and both times on errands rather than recreation. She also noticed that when he spoke to her, he listened to her answers with a quality of attention that she had come to understand was not common. Most men in her experience listened to women the way they listened to weather reports, waiting for it to be over so they could respond with what they had already decided. Clayton Dalton listened the way he worked, with complete presence and without waste. She was not falling in love with him. She was not in any condition to be falling in love with anyone. She was simply noticing. She was allowed to notice. The first time she had dinner with him was an accident that became an arrangement. He had come to help her with a problem she had with her water pump, a mechanical issue that she had diagnosed correctly but lacked the specific tool to address, and Clayton had that tool and the knowledge to use it. The repair took the better part of an evening, and by the time it was resolved, the sun had gone down and she was standing in her kitchen, which smelled of the stew she had put on that morning, and politeness dictated that she invite him to eat. She expected him to decline. He said, "Thank you, I appreciate it." They ate at her kitchen table with the lamp between them and the sound of the summer night coming through the open window, and the conversation moved in the way it had been moving for weeks, easily, without strain, touching on the practical and occasionally on the less practical, on the state of the crops and the Kansas weather and the news that came through Harrow Creek, and also on things like what he had read recently. which turned out to be a worn copy of a philosophy text he had picked up in Dodge City because it looked interesting and which had, he admitted, confounded him more than it illuminated. "Which philosopher?" she asked. He told her. She said she had read that one 2 years ago, and that she had found the middle chapters more useful than the rest. And they spent 20 minutes on this topic, which was not the kind of thing two people discuss across a kitchen table in Harrow Creek, Kansas, unless they both want to. When he left, he stood on her porch for a moment and said, "Thank you for the meal, Eva," with the kind of specificity that meant he was not thanking a neighbor but thanking her, Eva, as a particular person whose company had been a gift. She said it was nothing. He said it was not nothing and rode home. She stood on the porch and watched the dark until Remnant and Clayton disappeared into it, and then she went back inside and washed the dishes and thought about nothing at all very carefully for about an hour. The summer deepened. The dinner became a not quite regular occasion, driven by proximity and the logic of the work, because a man and a woman neighboring each other in the endless Kansas summer will find reasons to share a table if they are already finding reasons to share a fence line. They did not discuss what they were doing, they simply did it. He came on Thursday evenings most weeks, and sometimes on Sundays after the practical work of the day was done, and she cooked because she liked to cook and had always considered it a waste to cook for one person, which was something she had told herself for 16 months without it being true until now. Hector and Nellie Buell noticed, of course, because in a community like Harrow Creek noticing was a communal activity. Nellie said nothing direct but appeared at Eva's door one afternoon with a jar of preserves and a look that contained entire sentences. "He's a good man," Nellie said, eventually, when the preserves were accepted and the tea was made. "He's a good neighbor," Eva said. "Those can be the same thing," Nellie said, with the serenity of someone who has been right about enough things in 71 years that she no longer needs to argue about it. Micah, for his part, had developed a frank admiration for Clayton that manifested as detailed reporting of everything Clayton had ever said to him, which Eva received with a straight face and a privately amused heart. Micah was considering whether to pursue trail driving or whether to stay in Kansas and farm, and Clayton had apparently told him that both choices were legitimate and neither was a failure, and that the right one was the one that still felt right after you had thought about it long enough to stop arguing with yourself. Eva thought this was very good advice. July brought a crisis. There was a man in Harrow Creek named Rupert Crane, who had a way of appearing in difficult situations wearing the expression of a solution. He was a land agent, or called himself one, and he worked for a larger interest out of Wichita that was buying up homesteads in the area with the combination of legal pressure and financial desperation that the drought years had created. Eva had dealt with him before, the previous autumn, when he had come to her property with an offer to buy, and a suggestion that a woman alone managing a farm was eventually going to find it more than she could handle. She had sent him away without much ceremony. He came back in July with a piece of paper that purported to show a lien on the eastern portion of her property, a claim she had never heard of, drawn up with the kind of authoritative language designed to produce fear in people who were not certain of their rights. She read the paper 3 times at her kitchen table. Then she rode into town and went to see the county land recorder, whose name was Solomon Branch, and who was a meticulous man in his 60s who took the paper, read it carefully, and told her to come back the following morning. She came back the following morning, and Solomon Branch told her that the lien as presented had procedural irregularities that made it questionable at best, and that she should consult with someone who knew property law, and that the nearest person who fit that description was a lawyer named Aurelius Webb who came to Harrow Creek from Wichita on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month. The 2nd Tuesday was in 5 days. She rode home. Clayton was at her fence line when she arrived, and something in the way she dismounted communicated itself to him, because he opened the gate and walked toward her with the particular watchfulness of a man who has learned to read weather in all its forms. "What happened?" he asked. She told him about the paper. She told him what Solomon Branch had said. She told him she was waiting for the lawyer. He listened with the full attention he brought to everything, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you have your original property deed and the documentation from when you filed the homestead?" he asked. "Yes, in the house." "Keep those secure. Don't let anyone take them or make copies without you present." "I know," she said. "I have them." He looked at her, and she could see that he understood she had this under control, but that he was also someone who found it difficult not to offer something when someone he cared about was facing a problem. She noticed the word in her own thinking, cared about. "Thank you," she said. "I will handle it." "I know you will," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice at all, none of the well-meaning condescension that she had spent years navigating, just simple recognition of a fact he considered settled. She went inside. She went inside and stood in her kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed, and realized that the breathing was not entirely about the lien. Aurelius Webb arrived on the second Tuesday and was a small, dry man in his 50s, who wore a suit that had survived better days and carried a satchel that had not, and who read documents with a speed and focus that suggested he was genuinely good at his job. He reviewed the lien, reviewed Eva's original documentation, asked several precise questions, and then sat back and told her that the lien was not valid, that it had been drawn up against a name that did not precisely match the name on her deed, which was a technical error, but one that the courts would consider in her favor, and furthermore that the entity behind the claim had recently come under scrutiny from the county over similar maneuvers with 3 other homesteads north of Harrow Creek. "You're not their first attempt," Aurelius Webb said, "and you won't be their last. But your documentation is clean and your deed is solid, and if this comes to anything further, I can represent your interests. My fee is modest." She paid him his fee on the spot from the cash she kept in the coffee tin on the high shelf, the cash Thomas had told her to always keep because the banks out here were not reliable friends. She rode home feeling lighter than she had in a week, and Clayton was in his west field when she passed on the road, and she called out to him and he rode over, and she told him how it had gone, and he listened, and when she was done he said, "Good, just good," with the kind of finality that closed the matter and opened the next thing. "I want to celebrate," she said, surprising herself. He looked at her. One eyebrow moved very slightly. "I'll bring the coffee," he said. "You cook." "I was already planning to cook," she said. He smiled then, a full smile which she had seen perhaps 3 times before and which was, she could now acknowledge privately to herself, exceptionally good on his face. She cooked a proper meal that evening, the kind of meal she had not made since Thomas was alive. A roasted chicken with the rosemary from her garden, potatoes from the cellar, apple preserves from Nellie Buell, corn bread with honey, and she brought out the good plates that she had kept wrapped in cloth in the cabinet and had not used in a year and a half. He arrived with the coffee as promised, and he noticed the good plates without saying anything about them, and they sat down and ate, and the conversation that evening was different from the other evenings, less practical, more open, moving in longer arcs through questions about who they were and where they had come from and what they understood about the world. She told him about her parents, the way her father had worked himself past the point of health for a piece of land that had ultimately given them a good life, and how she had watched him do it and thought it was foolish until she had come to Kansas herself and understood it from the inside. He told her about 6 years on the cattle trail, the particular loneliness of a life spent moving, the companionship that came and went, the way the land looked different from horseback when you crossed it over and over, how the Kisham Trail had taught him more about the size of things than anything else he had encountered. "Were you ever afraid out there?" she asked. He considered this with his customary thoughtfulness. "Yes," he said, "but not usually of the things you'd expect. Not of weather or distance or even some of the rough men on the trail, mostly of the prospect of arriving somewhere and finding it had nothing to say to me. And Kansas," he looked at her steadily. Kansas has a great deal to say, he said. The lamp flickered between them. Outside the window, a coyote called far away in the dark and was answered by another, and Eva thought, not for the first time, that this Kansas night was a very large thing, and that sitting inside the light with another person was not a small comfort. He stayed later than he usually did, and when he finally stood to leave and she walked him to the porch, they stood for a moment in the warm dark with the stars doing their sprawling Kansas work overhead, and he turned to her and said, "I find myself looking forward to Thursday." She looked up at him. "It's not Thursday every time," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is mostly Thursday." She laughed then, a real laugh, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of, and his face did something in response to the sound of it that she saw clearly in the dark and chose to hold close. "Good night, Clayton," she said. "Good night, Eva," he said. He rode home. She sat on the porch in the warm dark for a long time afterward, listening to the night and not fighting what she was feeling. August. The wheat came in and it was good, better than good. It was the kind of harvest that changes the arithmetic of a year, the kind that means the winter is not something you simply survive, but something you move through with a degree of security that allows for breathing. Eva worked the harvest with Micah and hired 2 additional hands for the week of heavy cutting, men who came down from north of Harrow Creek and who were reliable and gone by the following Sunday. Clayton helped on the last 2 days, not because she asked, but because he appeared at first light on Friday morning with his own tools and asked where she needed him. She put him to work without ceremony, and he worked with the same quiet efficiency she had come to expect from him, and Micah watched him with the kind of respect that meant something coming from a 16-year-old who had his own ideas about work. When it was done and the grain was stored and the last of the hands had gone, Eva sat on her front porch in the late afternoon gold that was the best light Kansas produced, the kind of light that made even the cracked earth look like something that had been worth fighting for, and Clayton sat in the other chair, the chair that had been Thomas's chair, and that she had not sat in herself since Thomas died but had, without deciding to, sat on the porch at some point in recent weeks, and she thought about that. "The harvest was good," he said. "Yes," she said, "better than I expected." "You expected it to be good," he said, and there was something like amusement in his voice. "I expected it to be adequate," she said. "Good is better than adequate." "A lot of things are," she looked at him. He was looking at the light on the fields, and she could see what the last 2 days of hard work had done to him, the pleasant, worn look of it, and she thought that there was something fundamentally honest about the way Clayton Dalton inhabited his own tiredness. "Thank you," she said. "For these last 2 days, you didn't have to." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and there was a long pause that was not uncomfortable, just full. "Because helping you matters to me," he said simply. "Because you matter to me." "I think you probably know that by now." She looked at him. The late light was orange, and the air smelled of cut grain and the summer's end, and the faint green of the garden behind the house. And Eva Grayson had her hands folded in her lap, the hands that were always marked with the work of this land, the nails short and the palms calloused and the skin darkened from the sun. And she thought about what it meant that those were her hands, that she had built them into exactly what they were, and that the man sitting in the chair beside her was looking at her with the kind of steadiness that was not a performance. "I know," she said softly. "And," he asked. The single word was careful, not demanding, just present. She was quiet for a moment longer. "I was not supposed to feel this way again," she said. "I had made a kind of peace with not feeling this way." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to undo the peace you made." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her directly. "Nothing right now," he said. "I'm not asking anything, I'm just being honest. I thought you deserved that." She breathed. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "I believe you." "I loved him. I know that too. It's not simple," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't think it was." She looked out at the fields, her fields, the ones that carried the marks of everything she had put into them. "I need more time," she said. "Not because I don't feel, but because I need to be sure that what I feel is real and not just." She stopped. Loneliness, he said quietly, not unkindly. Yes, she said, not just loneliness. He nodded. Take the time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. A small pause. The lease on the Cutter place is 3 years. She laughed again, softly, and he smiled. And the evening came down around them with the grasshoppers starting up in the fields and the first cool breath of what might eventually become September. September in Kansas was a mercy after August, and the mercy came as advertised, the heat softening slightly, the nights cooling to something that felt like relief, and Eva moved into the autumn work with the energy of someone who had been given both a good harvest and something else that had quietly changed the quality of the light. She did not rush herself. She was honest about this internally and grateful for the honesty. There was a difference between the warmth she had begun to feel and the certainty she required, and she was a woman who believed in the certainty. She had earned that standard. She had earned the right to require it of herself. But she also noticed that the Thursdays and Sundays had become something she moved toward now rather than simply accepted, and that when she saw Clayton at the creek, or the fence line, or the occasional gathering at the Buell property, something in her settled in a way that was distinct from the other kinds of settling she had worked so hard to achieve. He never pressed. He never leaned into what he had said on the porch with the expectation of an accounting. He was simply there, consistently and entirely, the way the good things are there when they are real. It was Nellie Buell in the end who named it out loud. Eva had gone to visit on a Wednesday afternoon when Hector was out, and Nellie was in the kitchen with her preserved fruits and her opinions, and they had talked about the harvest and about Micah, who had told his parents he was thinking of staying in Kansas and farming rather than going on the trail. And Eva had found herself talking about Clayton and the harvest and the porch conversation without initially noticing what she was revealing. And then she noticed, and she stopped. Nellie looked at her with those old knowing eyes. "Eva," she said gently, "you love him." Eva looked at her hands on the kitchen table. "I think I might," she said quietly. "There is no might about it," Nellie said. "I have been watching you for 4 months. A woman who is maybe possibly interested has a different look than a woman who is in love. You have the second look." Eva absorbed this for a moment. "Is it too soon?" she asked, and it was the question she had been carrying for weeks, the question under all the other questions. Nellie was quiet for a moment, thoughtful in the way of someone who respects a question enough to take it seriously. "Thomas is not coming back," Nellie said. "And loving Clayton Dalton does not diminish a single thing that was true between you and Thomas. Those were real. They live in you. This is also real. Both things can live in you at once." Eva looked at the window and the Kansas afternoon outside it, the slant of September light on Nellie's kitchen garden. "I am afraid," she said. "Of what?" She thought about it honestly. "Of losing again, of being rebuilt around another person and then having it taken." Nellie reached across the table and covered Eva's hands with her own. "You cannot protect yourself from loss by refusing love," she said. "You would only be protecting yourself from life, and you are too good at living to do that to yourself." Eva looked at Nellie's hands over hers, and thought about this woman who had buried 2 children and 1 husband before she found Hector, and who had still built this kitchen and these preserves and this community of warmth that people moved toward. "Thank you, Nellie," she said. She rode home slowly, through the long September afternoon, and she did not go inside when she reached her property. She rode east along her fence line until she reached the shared border with the Cutter place, and Clayton was in his south field and he saw her, and he rode over. They met at the fence. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, and he waited with the patience that was his particular gift. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I am done taking my time," she said. "I know what I feel. I have known for a while and I have been being careful with it, but I am done being careful." He was very still. "What are you feeling?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and even, but there was something in it that was not entirely steady. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to, and I took my time making sure it was true, and it is true." The field between them was very quiet. A hawk crossed the sky to the south. He moved remnant to the fence and he reached across it and took her hand, her soil-dark, work-marked hand, and he held it between both of his, and when he looked at her his eyes were direct and clear and full of something that required no interpretation. "I have been in love with you," he said carefully, "since you looked up from that garden in April and told me you already knew about the fence post." She laughed, and it broke the perfect seriousness of the moment in exactly the right way. "I did not already know," she said. "I know you did not," he said. "That was the thing that finished me. You looked me right in the eye and said you knew and you absolutely did not know, and the combination of all of it, the certainty, the stubbornness, and the fact that you immediately went to fix it, that was when I was done for entirely." She was still smiling, but there were also tears that she was not fighting because out here at the fence line with only the hawk and the September sky as witness she did not need to fight anything. "Come to dinner Thursday," she said. "I will be there," he said. He held her hand for another moment, and then he lifted it and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was not at odds with the roughness of their hands and the dirt on his boots and the Kansas wind around them, but was instead entirely consistent with the kind of man he was, a man who understood that small gestures of tenderness were not weakness, but their own kind of power. She rode home, and the afternoon had a quality she could not name exactly, but that she recognized as joy. October came in golden and earnest. The dinners on Thursdays became different, full of the particular electricity of people who have named what they are to each other, and are learning what that means in small, everyday ways. He brought her things sometimes, small things, a book from Wichita that he had ordered because he remembered she had mentioned the author, a bundle of dried herbs from the market that matched what she kept in the kitchen, once a single late-season wildflower he had found growing against the fence post, which he handed to her with such complete naturalness that she understood he had thought about it, and decided not to make it into a production. She cooked for him with the same naturalness. She had a good hand in the kitchen and she knew it, and cooking for him was one of the ways she showed care, the practical intimacy of feeding someone well. They began to sit closer together in the evenings, naturally, without announcement. He would sometimes read while she worked at the table, and the silence between them was domestic in a way that felt both new and oddly ancient, as if this was a specific frequency they had been waiting to find. He held her hand when they walked outside after dinner, and the first time he had done it she had led him without comment, and the second time she had folded her fingers around his first. He kissed her for the first time in late October, on a Sunday evening when the air had turned properly cold and they were standing on her porch after dinner, and he had said he should probably go, and she had said yes, probably, and neither of them had moved, and then he had turned to her and asked, very quietly, "May I?" And she had said yes without hesitation, and it was a quiet, unhurried kiss that contained both the accumulated weeks of knowing each other and something that felt like a beginning rather than a conclusion. When they pulled back, he looked at her with those direct eyes and she looked at him, and the October stars were extraordinary above them in the way they always were out here, and she thought, yes, this is real, this is the certainty she had been waiting for, and it arrived not like a surprise but like something she had been growing all along without entirely knowing what it would become. "I should go," he said. "Yes," she said. He went. She stood on the porch and pressed her palm flat against the wood railing, grounding herself in the physical world, and she was smiling, and it was the kind of smile that she could not have constructed deliberately if she had tried. November. The community of Harrow Creek was small enough that people knew, or guessed, or commented, and Eva navigated the social texture of this with the same practicality she brought to most things. Nellie Buell was openly pleased in the gracious way that did not embarrass anyone. Hector told Clayton he was a lucky man in a tone that was brotherly and direct. Gerald Phelps at the general store noted that she and Clayton had been seen riding together with the expression of a man filling in an entry in his mental ledger. There was one conversation she had with Rupert Crane in early November that she had not expected, and she handled it in her characteristic fashion. Crane had come back to Harrow Creek, as she supposed he always would, turning up in places where he sensed opportunity, and he had stopped her in the street with his usual air of a man who considered himself more useful than he was. "I heard you've taken up with the Dalton fellow at the Cutter place," he said, by way of opening. She looked at him. "What I've taken up with is my own business," she said. "Just being neighborly," he said. "No," she said very clearly, "you are not. Rupert, the last time you came to my property, you tried to intimidate me with a fraudulent piece of paper. A lawyer with 30 years of experience told me it was invalid within about 40 minutes. I do not want neighborly conversation from you. What I want from you is the road ahead of me and nothing else." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has underestimated someone repeatedly and has not yet extracted the lesson. She walked past him and did not look back. She told Clayton about it that evening and he listened, and when she was finished he said nothing about Crane specifically, only looked at her with something like admiration that he did not try to moderate. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. December came cold and serious. Christmas in Harrow Creek was a modest affair by the standards of larger places, but had its own texture. The community pulling together against the cold in the way of people who know the value of warmth. And Nellie and Hector Buell threw their annual gathering, which had for 30 years been the anchor of the season. Eva baked pies and brought them, and Clayton came with her, and they arrived together in a way that was simply what it was, a man and a woman who belonged to each other coming through the door of friends' home. Micah was there with his parents, looking very grown-up in a clean shirt, and he shook Clayton's hand with the gravity of a young man who had decided to be a farmer and wanted to mark this decision with appropriate seriousness. He was not going on the trail. He had talked to his parents and they had agreed, and the Buell property would eventually be his. Eva felt something soft and proud at this, because Micah was a good young man and Kansas would be lucky to keep him. They ate and they talked and they sang the songs that people sing in December in cold places, and at some point in the evening Clayton found her in the kitchen while she was helping Nellie with the coffee, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her and she looked back. "Happy?" he asked. She thought about the word and what it meant and whether she had a right to it and whether she had been honest enough with herself to earn it. "Yes," she said. "Very." He smiled. Nellie at the stove made no comment but was visibly delighted. January of 1875 was a hard month, cold and relentless in the way of Kansas winters, but Eva had a good cellar and a solid house, and enough firewood and a neighbor who appeared regularly to check that the firewood situation remained adequate, and she navigated the hard month with more security than the previous January had allowed. There was a night in late January when a storm came down from the north with the seriousness of real danger, the temperature dropping faster than expected, and Clayton rode over at early evening before the worst of it and said he was going to stay, that the crossing between their properties in the dark at the bottom of that temperature was more risk than was sensible. He slept in the barn, which was warm enough with the animals, and she made breakfast in the morning. And there was something about the normalcy of it, the two of them in the kitchen at dawn while the storm went on outside, that felt like the future making itself visible. Neither of them named it yet. They were moving toward the naming with the same patient confidence with which they moved toward most things. February. He came on a Sunday with a kind of particular intention that she recognized as something rehearsed, not in a stiff way, but in the way of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and wants to say it well. She had been in the garden. Even in February she was in the garden, planning the spring planting, marking the beds, thinking ahead the way farmers must, and she had soil on her hands because that was simply how she existed in this world she had built for herself. She looked up when she heard him come through the gate. He stopped a few feet from her. "I need to ask you something," he said. She stood up, brushing her hands against her work apron, and looked at him. "Then ask," she said. He took a breath that was not quite steady, and she found this deeply endearing, this one departure from his usual calm. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build something here with you on this land with this life that you have already made and that I want to be part of. Not to take it over, not to manage it, but to be beside you in it. I want to sit on that porch and drink coffee in the summer and argue about fence posts and have dinner on Thursdays and every other day too. I want what we have to be what it is for the rest of our lives." She looked at him in the February cold with the bare garden around them and the Kansas sky overhead in its winter white. "Clayton Dalton," she said. "Eva Grayson," he said. She stepped forward and took his face in her soil-marked hands and kissed him with everything she had, and he pulled her close and held her with the solidity of a man who intends to hold on and knows it. When they pulled back, she had tears on her face again, and she did not apologize for them. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He exhaled with a depth that told her how much he had wanted this answer, and she laughed at the audible relief in it. "Did you think I might say no?" she asked. "I thought you might say you needed more time," he said honestly. "I have taken all the time I need," she said. "I have been sure for months." He shook his head with a smile. "You could have told me. You could have asked sooner." He laughed at this, and she laughed too, and it was exactly right, the combination of the serious and the absurd, the gravity of what they had chosen and the lightness that came from choosing it. They told Hector and Nellie Buell that afternoon, and Nellie cried briefly and then recovered immediately and began discussing the practical arrangements, which was her love language in concentrated form. They wrote letters, Eva to her brother in St. Louis, Clayton to his sister in St. Louis, and it occurred to both of them simultaneously that their siblings were in the same city, and they spent a moment finding this remarkably funny. The wedding was in April. 1 year almost to the day from the morning Eva had stood up in her garden and asked Clayton what he thought he was staring at. They were married by the pastor who came to Harrow Creek on the second and fourth Tuesday, who was a practical man named John Hartley with a calm face and a strong voice. And they stood in front of a gathering of their small community in the church that was the cleanest building in Harrow Creek, and exchanged the vows that people have exchanged in the wild places of the world since the beginning, the simple promising of one person to another. Eva wore a dress she had sewn herself, dark green, because she had never been a white-gowned sort of woman, and green suited the person she was. Clayton wore a clean coat and his best shirt, and had shaved with a thoroughness that made Micah, who was present in his Sunday best with his parents, whisper to his mother that he had never seen Mr. Dalton looking so worried about anything, which was an observation that made Hector Buell suppress a grin. Eva walked up to Clayton without a moment's hesitation, and he looked at her with eyes that were direct and clear and full, and she thought that this was the right thing, the true thing, the thing that had grown out of April and the fence post and the barn roof and the dinners and the harvest and the porch in September. And it was good, it was honest, and it was hers. "I do," she said when it was her turn. "I do," he said when it was his. They were applauded by perhaps 20 people, including Nellie Buell, who had brought food to the reception afterward because of course she had, and Micah, who ate an impressive quantity of wedding cake, and Gerald Phelps from the general store, who had closed for the afternoon, which was unprecedented, and 3 other farming families from the area who had come to know and respect Eva over the years, and Aurelius Webb the lawyer, who had arrived to conduct some county business and had been invited on the spot. Eva's brother sent a telegram that arrived the morning of the wedding and said, "Very happy for you, stop, come visit someday, stop, or I will come there." It was the best telegram she had ever received. The spring that followed their marriage was the most alive Eva had felt in years, and she did not feel guilty about this anymore, did not qualify it or measure it against what had come before. It was its own thing, as Nellie had told her it would be. Thomas lived in the part of her that he had always lived in the knowledge of what the farm meant, and the memory of building it, and the years of his steadiness. And Clayton lived in the present and the future, in the man who rose before dawn and made coffee, and handed her a cup without being asked, who argued with her pleasantly about the best rotation for the south field, who could fix almost anything mechanical with a patience that she found enviably superhuman, and who looked at her every day with the direct and uncomplicated certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be. They combined the properties. Not in a legal amalgamation exactly, but in the practical daily sense that two neighboring operations, when run by two people who trust each other completely, begin to function as one. The Cutter Place lease was renewed for another 3 years, with the option to purchase, which Clayton began working towards systematically. The wheat from Eva's land and the cattle operation Clayton had begun to build became complementary, and the farm began to grow in a way that felt not like ambition, but like natural consequence. Micah Buell came to work full-time for them in the summer, with the plan that he would eventually lease a piece of land from them when he was ready to establish his own operation, which was an arrangement that suited everyone and made Hector Buell look quietly proud in the way of men who feel that things have turned out as they ought to. Summer bloomed hot and generous. In the evenings they sat on the porch they now thought of as theirs, 2 chairs and sometimes a third for Micah when he stayed late, and the grasshoppers sang in the fields and the sky went through its extravagant Kansas colors, and they talked or they were quiet, and both were equally good. Eva told him things she had not told anyone in years. He told her things about the trail years that he had not unpacked for examination before, the loneliness of movement, the particular grief of a life spent arriving and leaving, and how Kansas had caught him when he was not prepared to be caught, and how she had caught him further in a way that the land, remarkable as it was, could not do alone. "You were the door I did not know I was looking for," he told her one evening in June, with the unself-consciousness of a man who had decided that choosing the exact right word mattered even if it was not what men were supposed to say. She pressed herself close to him, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the night come down over their land. In the autumn of 1875, Eva told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Thursday morning before sunrise, with the lamp between them and the coffee made, and the words simple and direct, because she was not a woman who built to a revelation. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with something that exceeded the capacity of any description she could produce, and said, "Eva," just her name, just that. "Are you happy?" she asked, already knowing. "Happy is not the right word," he said. "It's too small." She laughed into his chest. They told Nellie that afternoon, and Nellie sat down on her kitchen chair and put her hands over her heart and said, "Oh, good," with the completeness of someone for whom those 2 words contained everything. The pregnancy was not easy in all its particulars. The Kansas winter was hard, and the nausea in the early months was a serious business. But Eva was healthy and determined, and Clayton was present in all the ways that mattered, which meant not hovering but being available, not directing but supporting, bringing her the things she needed without making her ask twice. They negotiated the fine line between her fierce independence and his equally fierce protectiveness with a combination of humor and honesty that they had been practicing for over a year and had become reasonably expert at. "I can still carry that," she told him. "I know you can," he said. "I would like to carry it anyway." "Why?" "Because I want to," he said simply. "Same reason you cook the good meals on Sundays, because doing something for the people you love is its own satisfaction." She handed him the water pail. The winter was long and the spring was slow to arrive, and their son was born in March of 1876, in the main house with the help of the doctor who came up from Harrow Creek, and a woman named Frances Doyle who had attended more births than she could count and had hands that inspired confidence. It was a long labor, serious and exhausting, and Clayton waited outside the bedroom door with the kind of still focus that is faith rather than composure. And when Eva's voice changed, and then the other voice arrived in the world, a voice that was new and indignant and entirely itself. He pressed his forehead against the doorframe and breathed. Francis Doyle came out 20 minutes later and told him he had a son, and that Eva was doing well and that he could go in. He went in. Eva was in the bed with the new small fact of their son against her chest, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Come see." And he came to the bedside and looked at this small person who had Thomas Grayson's nose, apparently, and Clayton Dalton's hands already, according to Eva, and who was currently sleeping with the absolute certainty of someone who has resolved a very difficult undertaking. "What is his name?" Clayton asked quietly. Eva looked at him. They had discussed this and had an agreement, and it was her to say. "James Thomas Dalton," she said. He looked at her, and there was the full weight of it in his face, the acknowledgement of what she had done, the generosity of it, the way she had held both things at once with the grace that was entirely her own. "That's a good name," he said, his voice not entirely steady. "It is," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against him, and James Thomas Dalton slept on between them. Spring came to Harrow Creek in the slow, reliable way it always did, taking its time, but arriving. The farm in 1876 was a different place from the farm in 1873. Not unrecognizable, not transformed into something it was not, but grown. The wheat fields were larger. The cattle operation that Clayton had built was modest but solid, with 20 head of good stock. The apple orchard had finally committed, and that spring produced blossoms in a quantity that had Eva standing under the trees for a full 10 minutes one afternoon, just looking up. Micah Buell had begun leasing a small parcel to the north and was doing well on it, coming to them 3 days a week still, but as a colleague rather than an employee, which was a distinction he carried with pride and which they respected. The Cutter place had been purchased. The deed was in both their names, Eva Grayson Dalton and Clayton Dalton, because Eva had insisted that the paperwork reflect the reality, and Clayton had considered this for about 30 seconds before saying it was only sensible, which she had appreciated more than a grander gesture would have been. Rupert Crane had not returned, having apparently found other territory to trouble, which suited Harrow Creek entirely. On a warm Sunday in May, with the apple blossoms still in the air, and James Thomas Dalton on a blanket in the barnyard at 3 months old, examining the world with the focused scrutiny of a person who is new to it and finding it remarkable, Eva stood at the garden fence and looked at her land. Clayton came up beside her with 2 cups of coffee, which was his habit on Sunday mornings, and handed her one and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about that morning last April," she said, "when you were on the road and I was in the garden. When you told me you already knew about the fence post." "When I absolutely did not know about the fence post," she said, "and you saw right through me. I did not say anything. Your face said something," he smiled. "What did my face say?" She looked at him with those dark eyes that still, after more than a year of being his wife, carried that fire he had seen in April, that quality of being entirely present and entirely herself that had arrested him on the road on a Tuesday morning and not released him since. "Your face said you found me interesting," she said. "I found you extraordinary," he said. "I still do." She looked back at the garden, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, her hair loose at her shoulders in the Sunday morning way, and behind her the farm spread out in the May light, the fields and the orchard and the barn that no longer leaked and the house that held their life together. "I was so angry that morning," she said, "about the calf we had lost and the fence and all of it. I know, you were magnificent. I was furious." "Yes," he said, "that's what I said." She laughed and pressed against him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and James Thomas Dalton gurgled thoughtfully at the sky from his blanket. "I am very glad you stopped," she said. "I am very glad you looked up," he said. The May morning was everywhere around them, in the apple blossoms and the warming earth and the sounds of the farm waking up, and Eva Grayson Dalton stood in the middle of all she had built and all she had become, with her husband beside her and her son on the blanket and the soil, as always, somewhere on her hands, and felt the particular wholeness of a life that has come through its hard seasons to arrive, at last, in something worth arriving at. They stood there together for a long time. Harrow Creek hummed and breathed around them in the Kansas morning. The grasshoppers started up in the fields to the east. Somewhere in the apple orchard, a bird was conducting its own enthusiastic assessment of the situation. James Thomas Dalton decided, with the authority of 3 months of life, that the sky was extremely satisfactory and communicated this view vocally. Clayton handed Eva his coffee cup so he could pick up his son, and she held both cups and watched him lift James Thomas against his chest with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to hold something precious and fragile and is never careless with it. And James Thomas looked up at his father with the widest eyes in Harrow Creek, Kansas. "Good morning," Clayton told him, very seriously. James Thomas responded with a sound that contained words. Eva stood with the 2 coffee cups and the May light on her face and watched her husband and her son, and the orchard bloomed behind them, and the wheat grew in the east field, and the chickens, all 12 of them now, conducted their daily business with full conviction, and the fence posts held, all of them including the 3rd one from the east which had been solid for over a year and would remain so. And the sky above the Flint Hills of Kansas was the particular and irreducible blue that it only ever was on a May morning, clear and deep and going on forever in every direction that mattered. This was the life. Not the life she had expected, not the life she had planned, not the life that had come to her without cost or grief or the long education of loss. It was the life she had built, with her hands in the soil and her eyes open, in this wild and enormous country that asked everything of you and gave back exactly what you were willing to become. She handed Clayton back his coffee. He took it without looking away from James Thomas. She looked at the fence line, at the road beyond it, at the place where a man on a horse had once stopped on a Tuesday morning and changed everything without either of them knowing it yet. She pressed her free hand flat against the fence post, her palm against the warm wood of it, feeling the solidity of the thing she had built and was still building, and she was grateful, with the full weight of the word, for all of it. For the soil and the fire and the fence post. For the man who had stopped. For the woman she had always been and was still becoming. For this life that was entirely, completely, and abundantly theirs.